Recognizing that we're running a little late, I'm going to be very short in my introduction because I think that this is going to be one of the kind of out of the kind of mainstream of what we do here at the McCain Institute. You have seen a lot of love, a lot of bipartisan love today, right? Isn't that great? We saw various political leaders coming together and saying, these are not partisan issues, these are things that we're all working on. But now we're going to talk a little bit about politics. And I thought about these two guys who I know pretty well. I currently serve on the Board of Trustees for the McCain Institute and have really gotten to know Rick and got hoodwinked into becoming a fellow at the Institute of Politics in Chicago, and currently serve on David's Board of Directors. And so I think I can say this with a lot of credibility. You know, in politics, you think it's all rough and tumble, and people who are so-called political operatives are those evil guys or women behind who will do anything to win, who will fight a fight in any way possible to make sure that they have the right outcome. That is not these two people. These two people represent the best of people who work in politics, because the one unifying factor for both of them is they love America and they love democracy. The second unifying event is that they love who they work for. David, as a chief strategist for the Barack Obama 2008 campaign, was somebody who very early on believed in Barack Obama and took on a client when maybe a lot of other people wouldn't, but he understood what that would mean for the United States of America, this transformative political leader. Rick is like a son to John McCain, and believed in him and believed in his leadership, continues to believe that he carries the torch for their leadership. And so think about how remarkable it is that we're on this stage thinking only back to 2008, and you see two people who have been in the Super Bowl of politics, literally the Super Bowl of politics. And they're sitting on a stage today going to share a conversation with all of you about the current state of politics and what's happening in the midterms. It's really, truly remarkable, but it's remarkable character of these two individuals. And Hannah, I know you're going to have a great time, but I want to close with a final thought. When I think of John McCain and I think of that campaign, I think of two moments that define the decency of what we had in 2008. The first time was an older woman in a Minnesota rally who was taking on Barack Obama, repeating the lies that she had heard over and over again in other media about who Barack Obama was. And you could see John McCain thinking, I just don't want to hear this. You could see it in his face, and then all of a sudden he realized the decent thing to do was to correct the record in real time. Think of how different our politics would be today if we had politicians who turned and corrected the record in real time, who stood up for decency. And I think one of the most remarkable political speeches of my lifetime was the concession speech that John McCain gave the night that he had to come out and say, it's always been a dream, and I think I would have been a great leader. But today, as America, we come together. And so I want you to think about these two individuals who led those two campaigns and who now come together to share their thoughts on what's going to happen. Take it away, Hannah.
Thank you. Senator, thank you very much. So my name's Hannah Vaughan Jones. First of all, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Ambassador McCain, to the McCain Institute as well, for welcoming me here. I sat next to General Clark at dinner last night. I can honestly say it was the safest I've ever felt over a Cobb salad. So thank you very much for that, much appreciated. Welcome to Midterm Mania. This is the last panel of what's been a really incredible forum. The whole theme for this forum, of course, is strategic competition. So who better than political strategists and renowned competitors, Rick Davis, David Axelrod, to really chew the fat and get into the congressional races and the key battlegrounds. Alas, they stuck you with a Welsh journalist. So interesting choice. So forgive me if we take a slightly broader brush approach with this conversation. So I'd like to start by turning away from the elected and looking at the electorate instead. How does the American voter feel about the democratic process in 2022? David?
Well, I think they're probably doing less thinking about the democratic process than about their lives. And I think that there are a lot of forces buffeting people today. When you think of the economic forces, the hangover of the pandemic, the events in Ukraine that we see each night on television, violence in our communities and so on. And so I think there's a lot of unease, and that, of course, bleeds into the democratic process. It's true, Hannah, historically, that parties who hold the White House tend to do poorly in midterm elections in this country. And there's nothing that I see that would change that here. I mean, this is an opportunity for people to vote their discontent, and they tend to do that. And that makes it very difficult for the governing party.
Do you think that the American voter is more enthusiastic, though, than in recent times? I only ask because when I look at it in comparison to Britain, I'd say there's a lot of apathy around at the moment. There's COVID fatigue, there's political fatigue, there's Boris fatigue, it kind of goes on and on. So is that a similar vein happening over here?
I don't think that's what's happening over here. I totally agree with David that we are in an era of discontent. Voters are really unhappy, with the plight that they have, whether it's because of what's happening in their communities, as David described, with their safety and schools. Inflation bothers them. The world seems a lot more dangerous than it should be. I certainly feel like the world's a lot more dangerous after this 2 days of sessions, especially with some of the military experts we have. I'm going to go find a cabin in the woods and get some guns and protect myself. I don't know who are the Russians, the Chinese, the Canadians. I mean, I don't know who's going to come after me, but I'll be ready. And yet I do think this discontent, and it's been around a while. It's not unique to the last year and a half. Is a motivator for voters to participate in the electoral process. We saw that in spades in 2020. I mean, largest turnout of vote in 100 years. We used to actually work really hard to try and figure out, John McCain was really great on wanting to promote ideas and policies and laws that would promote more participation of voters, right? We were one of the very few Republicans that, were all for mail-in voting and things like that. Anything to try and get up participation rates. And nobody would have ever envisioned that we would have had voter participation rates at the level we had in 2020. And part of that was, I think, people felt that they wanted to express their discontent. And I think that's part of what's different than when David and I ran campaigns in 2008, where people were much more voting on what they wanted than what they didn't want. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a new development in politics, and yet it does motivate people to participate. And so I would anticipate very little apathy. Certainly the polling that I've read is that people want to get out and throw a punch.
But the question, what was remarkable about 2020 was there was a very large turnout on both sides.
Right.
The question is that going to be the case here? What generally happens in midterm elections is that there is disproportionate turnout among the party out of power. If you look at the election in Virginia last year, there was high turnout among Democrats, but higher turnout among Republicans, and particularly in rural areas where participation hadn't been particularly high. If that pattern repeats itself, it's going to be a challenge for Democrats.
And so looking then at who is voting and the divisive nature of politics across the democratic world at the moment, I'm thinking about the people who aren't necessarily pitched in one camp or the other, left or right, Republican, Democrat, but the middle ground, the undecided even, do they still exist? Is there still a scope to persuade people either from one side to the other or to just choose a side?
It's a smaller universe, I think Rick would agree, than it was in the past. I mean, we've become very, very tribal in our politics. That's reflected in the fact, for example, that if you look at the United States Senate now, there are only 6 senators who are in the Senate who represent states that voted for the other party's presidential candidate. Same is true in the House. There's not a lot of swing in the electorate. Doesn't mean that there isn't, I mean, that you can't create sort of larger communities of people around some issues and so on. But by and large, you know, the universe of persuadable voters is very small, and an emphasis has really been placed lately on turnout and getting your base out.
And so does that then reflect in how campaigns are run? Is there an assumption that everyone's just going to fall into their own echo chamber and stay put? So that's how you should target your campaigns?
Go ahead, Rick.
You know, my sense is that there's still a lot of turnover, right? I mean, part of the messaging that we have for the midterms is there's going to be a lot of turnover. So even though there's not a lot of voters in the middle, independent voters or swing voters, people do move from side to side on that ballot. Otherwise, it wouldn't just be turnout, right? The Republicans are going to win in House districts around the country, not just because the Republican turnout is higher than the Democratic turnout, but that people want something different. And it may be some of those independent voters, but it's going to be other voters too, including some Democratic voters voting across the aisle, like Republicans did in 2018 when there was a big shift the other way. So even though there's not a lot of voters who would self-identify as independent or swing voters, there is a lot of swinging in these elections that tend to follow more macro cycle changes rather than just one issue or one election. So I don't think it means that there's less competition, but I do think it means that when you look at a campaign and you know, 10 years ago you would have said there are 15% of the people you could move one way or another, you know, now you might be inside of 5.
Yeah, I also think that, I mean, the art of redistricting has been taken to another level, and there aren't that many, you know, truly competitive districts anymore. So you may have, there may be a tsunami in November, but it's not going to produce the 63 vote swing that we saw in 2008, for example, or 2010, I should say. It's likely to be smaller than that, enough to, if the current course and speed, enough to give Republicans control of the House, but not by the margins that we saw in the past.
So let's talk about then, like, the infrastructure. I mean, the political institutions of state at the moment, are they fit for purpose to represent properly the kind of the demographic that they're trying to reach?
Well, let me do what we are trained to do, which is repurpose your question for my own.
Okay, thank you very much.
For my own. But look, everything we're talking about and the sort of switch to more of an emphasis on mobilization, less on persuasion, also feeds what I think is a really unhealthy environment, which is basically people playing to the choir and trying to inflame the choir. We have a warped incentive structure in our politics that really favors division, favors outrage. That's how you motivate your base. And it makes it harder to govern. And you know, my great concern about the next election is that the people who are most likely to lose, you've seen a lot of sort of more traditional, moderate, center-right Republicans announcing their retirement, both in the House and the Senate. They're likely to be replaced by people who are more ideological and frankly more performative than the people who preceded them. And on the Democratic side, you're going to see a lot of moderate Democrat. Are there any Democratic members of the House here? Then let me speak freely. Oh, sorry, Congressman Smith. But you're in a safe district. I can say this. But I do think that a lot of very, very talented legislators are in jeopardy, and you're going to see a more polarized House, which is exactly what we don't need in this country right now.
Rick, on that point about the institutions of state being fit for purpose, would you agree with David that it's going to be difficult?
Yeah, I think if an institution is the party, you know, they actually play much less of a role in sort of the conduct of the campaign. I totally agree with David that It's been a long time where candidates have basically said, I'm not looking for new voters. I just want to turn out a higher percentage of my own voters. So you get into this dialogue, which is hot. The rhetoric is coarse. You know, there's more polarization. Karl Rove kind of typified it in 2004 when he said, I'm not looking to get swing voters in Ohio to win the presidency. I just want more white Christian males to turn out to vote, and I can win the state.
Yes.
So he didn't have to talk to anybody else, right? And so the campaign was very narrowly cast, and you get out of that narrowly cast elected officials. My own sense, looking around the country at what we're seeing in primaries, and it's still really early, right? There are a lot of primaries to take place. May is a big month for that. We'll know a lot more at the end of May and June than we do today. But my anticipation would be if the cycle's what we say it looks like it's going to be, and you're going to have a lot of Republicans coming in the House, they're not going to be guys looking to join the problem solvers caucus, right? They are the problem creators probably coming in on that wave.
Yes, that's a large caucus.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's a big concern, and the media environment sort of, you know, the tools of politics have been refined to the point where you have so much data, and you can find those voters that you want to mobilize, and you can tailor material to them, and the algorithms of the media platforms will tailor, you know, material to them that's meant to inflame, and so, you know, it's kind of a perfect storm. And when you add to that the circumstances we face today, in terms of all of the post-pandemic, you know, waves, you know, there is the, you know, you set up a situation where things could get worse. I'm just saying this because I want everybody to enjoy those prickly pear margaritas when we get to the next event.
I mean, I say this as an outsider looking in on America, but everyone wants to have more voters for their party, more supporters for their party.
That's necessary. Yeah.
It is. But do you want all of them, irrespective of their persuasion? Does it change the very nature of your party, for example, if you have certain voters coming in and supporting you and demanding, therefore, that you take a different course of action? How do you square that when you've got some people joining that fundamentally change what your party is?
Well, I'll let Rick answer that because they're coping with that over there.
Yeah, well, you should follow up because I think there's similar divisions within the Democratic Party. It's just when you have the White House, you shield a lot of that. Yeah, look, I mean, it is a fact of life, right? I mean, the Republican Party has a dilemma. Because, and it's not so much whether or not there are certain voters in the party and certain voters that are not. You want all of them inside and then manage that dynamic as much as you can. You win a lot more elections that way. Mm-hmm. And that is ultimately the way you can hold and adjudicate power. So the reality, too, is that the party changes over time, right? This Republican Party is decidedly different demographically than the Republican Party when I worked for Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 1984. What's interesting about it, and what has developed some of these fissures in the party today, is that we actually have, as David pointed out, a lot more energy in rural districts around the country, which brings a certain set of voters who have different priorities than potentially the party might have had 10 years ago, or certainly when John McCain ran for office for president. And yet we've lost some of those suburban voters that Ronald Reagan brought in that were sort of the core of the Republican winning machine for 25 years that was able to expand our hold in legislative districts and suburbs and exurbs that made us so competitive. And so there are some examples. Governor Youngkin was able to piece together an incredible turnout in rural America where you would have normally seen us getting 30-40% turnout of white vote and barely winning those districts, to overwhelmingly winning those districts with high turnout. Nobody thought Mecklenburg County would actually be a decisive county in Virginia, but like when they vote as heavily as they did and is unified within the Republican Party, then all of a sudden you've changed the entire dynamic, the demographics of the Republican Party in Virginia. But what Youngkin was able to do is also, through a series of issues, mostly around education, cultural issues, get back some of the suburban voters that have been lost to Donald Trump in 2020. And that became a model now where a lot of candidates in states that have those kinds of dynamics, lots of rural counties, a couple of suburban outholders. Arizona is one of those. The governor here has done a magnificent job of retaining both the suburban voters in Maricopa County, which governs a lot of the outcome of the election, but also has seen consistent and higher numbers out of the rural counties. That is a very difficult formula because what those rural Republican voters want is not necessarily the same thing as our suburban voters have wanted for a long time. And that adjudication is a very tricky business. You get it wrong and you lose.
Yeah, I think first of all, I point out the governor has been very successful, and yet he's not on the ballot this year. And I'll let him speak for himself, but not now. As to why, and and I think the part of the answer is that it was made difficult for him for taking the position that he took, that he was going to certify an election in this state. That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. But the converse of what you're saying is a problem for the Democratic Party, which is the Democratic Party has become increasingly a suburban, kind of college-educated, elite party, and has lost its ability to some degree to talk to rural voters, to non-college voters, to people who work with their hands. And that is a problem that Democrats have to address. And you talk about cultural issues. Republicans have always thrived when the debate was about cultural issues. Democrats, when they were successful, have tended to speak more universally about issues that are important across different class and demographic lines. That hasn't been the dynamic lately, and I think it is to the disadvantage of Democrats.
Truth.
Okay, this is where I'm going.
It's not truth or dare, don't worry. The concept of truth. Certainly in the UK at the moment, we have a prime minister who has been found to have broken the law. He has arguably kind of lied to the public and Parliament as well. You know, you could say that there is a huge honesty vacuum kind of through global leadership. Not necessarily in the present, across the world, but certainly over the last couple of years, we've seen that, I suppose. How damaging is that to democracy and upcoming elections when you have an electorate who know that, in many cases, promises made on the campaign trail will simply be broken? They will be broken.
Well, I think that's been true for time immemorial, okay? That's not new,
Brutus lied
new to politics. And I will say this, and I don't mean to, partisanize this discussion, but Donald Trump did an interview with Leslie Stahl back in 2016, and before the interview started, she asked him, why are you always picking on the media? Why are you picking on the media all the time? And he said, because I don't want people to believe you when you say bad things about me. And that is really... he didn't maybe intend it this way, but that's actually the blueprint for autocrats, which is if you create a sense of disbelief about facts and truth, and you control the dialogue, then you can, essentially thrive. And obviously Putin is a great practitioner of this. We see it right now. I think one of the great threats to democracy is the sort of the notion of alternative facts, the relative nature of truth. There are facts. What is this? But whatever it is, it is.
It is.
This is a chair. Okay.
This sounds like a CNN advert. Hang on. Okay.
This is, and there are facts. And the governor reacted to facts when he certified the election. But if people begin to disbelieve sources of information, sources of information that they used to trust, and they become relative, and we live in our own sort of media silos, that I think is a real threat to democracy. And I don't think we've completely developed a strategy for dealing with that, but we're going to have to, because it's only going to become more intense.
Yeah, and just to echo that, John McCain used to love to say, you can have a set of your own opinions, but you cannot have a set of your own facts. And we always thought that was an obvious ploy to be able to set aside, what I believe versus what you believe. But the reality now has become, there really has become a blurring of whose facts are the correct facts. And look, I mean, no offense to the media, but the media makes good use of that to sell newspapers, to get clicks, to get viewers on their various casts, because nothing sells like catching a politician in a lie or debating what he said when he said it. That being said, one of our favorite slogans always was, in the McCain campaign, we actually had T-shirts printed up, that spinning is lying. Well, lying is lying. and I think one thing to say, oh, our facts are different, or you can't have a set of facts, but I think it's beyond that at this stage. I think it's at the point now where people have to point out in civil society what a lie is. And we used to always say, wow, never say lying, right?
Yeah.
And how many times have we told our candidate, you cannot say your opponent is lying, because boy.
By the way, in the media, I mean, I'm an old journalist. We were told, do not use that word. Right. That is, you can state what the actual facts were, but don't characterize the person who misstated the facts.
Right.
I said allegedly or arguably about.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I mean,
I
the
wasn't
reality
saying
is
that.
we're now in an environment.
You were very assiduous.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I think, for the purpose of Straight Talk, we are in an environment where people are lying on a regular basis, and that pressure to not call someone a liar is starting to fade away. And it adds to what you were saying, I think, David, earlier, which is more caustic debate. It doesn't actually help it. It defines it, but it actually leads us back to this road where, people are actually going to get even more polarized by that. And I think that's part of what really astute people like you and the Institute of Politics in Chicago spend time thinking about, is how do we return to a place where there's some common facts, a ground to work off of that isn't moving under your feet all the time, where a proper discourse for a healthy democracy is something we're trying to.
But how you agree on what sources of facts are is really the rub. And a lot of what used to be respected sources of fact are now characterized as elite kind of political filters. And as we've seen in our own politics, you can rally people against the news media, for example, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not, as kind of another player in our politics. I mean, I would urge the news media not to play into that by behaving as such, by mixing opinion and fact. But we do talk about it a lot. I'll let you know when we find the answer.
When we're looking to the future then, and future leaders, and David and I both sit on the McCain Global Leaders Advisory Council, and I can safely say that based on the cohort this year, the future, we're in safe hands. They're incredible, absolutely incredible. But when it comes to kind of making sure that that people have the right attributes, personality attributes, campaigning styles, how important is truth to that? Is authenticity, is integrity, or is it just about sort of trying to win over a skeptical audience, whatever the lie is?
Well, authenticity is important.
Yeah.
I mean, I think authenticity in a presidential race is kind of the coin of the realm. But you can be authentic and a liar at the same time. Mm-hmm. The one thing I never said about Donald Trump was that he was inauthentic. Mm-hmm. He is very, very authentic. So authenticity is important, but what we have seen and what we need to really challenge is the other piece of it. And your prime minister is an example of that, where people get rewarded for the propagation of lies, mm-hmm. And that's an unhealthy development in our politics.
Rick, go on. Go ahead.
I was just going to pick up on something David just was mentioning, and that is sort of the difference between authenticity and what voters actually consume as information. And the good news about presidential campaigns, I've always believed, is that they're the most intensely personal campaign of any there is.
Yes. I once called it an MRI for the soul.
Right.
Whoever you are,
Right.
people come to know you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much vetting, there's so much attention. People check in much more, with all due respect to governors and senators and congressmen. Trust me, become a presidential candidate and find out whether people get to know you or not. And I encourage everybody to run for president someday. It's all part of the McCain Institute effort.
I thought you were out of the business.
Oh, no, I'm not going to manage anybody's campaign. I just want you to run. But that is the positive, right? I mean, we always sort of focus on the negative with campaigns or with elections or with politics. But one of the uniquely positive things is that system does tend to work in presidential campaigns. And then the question then is, how can you devolve some of that success in a presidential cycle where people are paying attention and they formulate their own opinions, but they're well-informed opinions? And how do you do that across a larger sample set at other elections across the country? And that's a trick that I think a lot of political professionals and political scientists spend time thinking about. And again, I think that would add to the real keenness of our democracy if we can find ways of using our massive communication system, all the social media, all the television, all the radio, all the things that we learn from in a little bit more positive and authentic way, if you want to call it that, in order for people to be informed but not,
Here's the question. Can you run a campaign? And I think that we will get to the point where we can again, where your goal, and I would argue that Biden sort of did last time, but where you're saying that we are one country, we are one community, and you appeal to some shared set of values and interests, and you kind of push back on the politics of division and the politics that profiteers off of our differences. Maybe people will reach a point. This is the optimist in me. But maybe people will reach a point where they say, that's what we want. I will say in the 2008 campaign, we certainly ran on that, in that vein. It didn't mean we didn't mix it up and so on and so forth. And so did Senator McCain, who had a very, I think, romantic and appropriately so vision of American democracy and about the country. The question is, how do we get back? How do we change the incentive structure so you actually get rewarded for running that kind of campaign? And the country has to swing back there. Voters have a responsibility as well. I mean, you can sit back and curse the political process, but if you don't participate in it, and I don't mean just in general elections, but in primary elections, and say, I'm actually going to reward the person who isn't going to try and tear us apart. If you don't do that, then you have less cause to complain.
Yeah, better to...
David, I think you made a really important point on the dynamic of the 2008 election. It's the last election where both presidential candidates that ended the campaign had a net positive, over 50% popularity rating with the American public after the end of the campaign. Subsequent to that, neither candidate had a 50% or above positive rating at the end of a campaign in any presidential campaign since then. Now, you think about that, right? You're electing someone who has a net negative popularity rating on the first day they're president of the United States. And I think that's part of what has to change, is that part of the messaging we have to have as a community in politics is that we're looking for people who we want to have as president, not fighting against somebody who you don't want to have as president.
We should point out this isn't just an American problem. President Macron just won re-election, and he had an approval rating of 36% because people decided that he was less awful than the alternative.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is, we're all struggling with this, and the problems of democracy are not just an American problem.
We only have a few minutes left, and I'm told that Senator McCain would always take questions from the floor at town halls, even when told not to. So given the fact that this is the last session of the day, I thought I'd open it out to the floor as well. So if anyone has a question, there's one over there.
Admiral?
There are a number of statewide elections and by that I mean governor, U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, that are won now by just thousands of votes. Former President Trump famously tried to get 11,000 votes out of Georgia. Separate from that, this month, we're going to cross a really awful threshold of 1 million COVID deaths in America. Most of those, majority of those, are in either the elderly, who tend to vote more, or non-vaxxers, anti-vaxxers rather. So has there been any predictive analysis on the outcome of that with the midterms and perhaps the national election in '24?
Let me turn it over to the Grim Reaper.
Yeah, I think most people, Admiral, have spent time worrying about like redistricting and gerrymandering and how many congressional seats might get turned over to Republicans, and it turns out all that's actually coming out pretty much even. So all the machinations about demographic changes that were supposed to happen in this election cycle, I know we still got to figure out what's going on in New York and a couple other places, but it was a kind of a big nothing burger. Look, obviously, if you look at demographics, and I don't have any specific issues, Republicans do better amongst people over the age of 55. Whether or not they're the ones who succumbed to COVID, I don't know, and I wouldn't want to even speculate. So, but I haven't seen any data that indicates one way or another whether or not that's going to have an impact on any particular state or race. But you're right, one of the really interesting phenomena is amongst all this debate that we've had about turnout and activity around the electorate, elections in these states tend to be won by smaller and smaller margins with bigger and bigger turnouts. Mm-hmm. So I would anticipate that you're going to see a lot of close elections again this year. Whether those kinds of impacts in states that had high COVID rates and high COVID deaths are impacted by that, I don't have a clue.
But I think it's a knowable fact because you can take the deaths and the voter rolls and who is removed from the voter rolls, and you can, there's data there. It's grim. I actually think some people have probably done it, but neither of us have the courage to actually speculate on it. So I know I see the clock's running down here.
I know.
So but can I just say one thing?
You can, yeah.
Let's take one more question real quick.
Good.
Now you're the one standing between us and a prickly pear margarita.
You gave you hand the microphone to a former
Not us anymore, guys.
You're never going to get your question, and you hand it to a former congressman there.
Skip the horse race question and go back to the conceptual question about whether our democratic structures are fit for purpose. We see midterm voters really acting more like a parliamentary election, treating elections as a national referendum on the president's ability to deliver, but we're not actually a parliamentary system where President Biden can deliver on that agenda. So one question is, how do we deal with that disconnect where we're a first past the post system, but people are really voting primarily on parties when we don't have strong party structures? And then we have a disproportionate power in the Senate, where a majority of Americans are now represented by 18 votes in the Senate, and a minority of Americans are represented by 82 votes in the Senate. And state identity doesn't matter in the same way that if you're a Republican in Georgia, you may feel more represented by Rick Scott or Ted Cruz than by Ossoff and Warnock, but the Senate structure was based on that idea. So I do want to push back on the question of whether we need to be thinking more creatively about the way our democracy functions, given that authoritarians benefit from the inability of democracies to deliver.
I would have warned you, don't give Perriello the last question because we'll never get out of here. Yes, I think there are structural issues that are really hard to solve, in part because they are built into our Constitution. And these states that are depopulating relative to other states, but have two representatives and so on, they're not going to yield power, and they, given the constitutional process, changing that structure is difficult, but it's obviously something that is concerning, as is the fact that as soon as we turn the corner on the election in 2022, we'll be into the presidential cycle of 2024, and if there's a new majority in the House, maybe in the Senate, some there are going to see their role as primarily to tear down the incumbent in preparation for the next election. So that contributes to what you're talking about and the level of cynicism that people feel about government's ability to function. But let me raise a separate issue that worries me a lot. And that is, we've heard a lot about technology here. Technology is churning at an ever faster rate. That's the nature of technology. It churns at an exponential rate. It has extraordinary implications for the economy, and we've seen that in the impacts that it's made on the lives of millions of people. It also obviously has changed the way we communicate with each other, and now, change is coming at us at this incredible rate, and it's coming. We open up our phone, and there's all this stimuli. Most of it designed to make us anxious. And at the same time, in our constitutional systems, they're designed to move slowly when we're divided. So we have these forces that are dividing us, coming at us very quickly, creating anxiety, and government becoming more and more difficult to be workable because democracies are designed that way when we're divided. I think that is creating a dissonance that builds on itself and is another challenge for democracy. So because I don't have an answer to your first question, I'm going to suggest that one of the other challenges we have is how do we get our arms around this change that's coming so rapidly and anticipate the challenges that we're facing in a way that allows us to function and gives people confidence that we are not just being buffeted by forces we can't control.
I would say just one thing I would add to that, and maybe back to more the institutional discussion that you raised, is, and I think I can channel John McCain a little bit on this, is some of our institutions are sort of ready-made for this, and there's been a whittling away of those institutions' influence in both public life, but also in government. And I think one shout-out I would have is there's been a lot of debate in the United States Senate about doing away with the filibuster rule. And the filibuster rule is there to protect a minority. And that was one of the things that was always a device that could level the playing field regardless of what the demographic shifts were happening in the country. And there's been a lot of good reason why Democrats and Republicans in the past have wanted to tinker with that. And the fact that it has survived this last year, when so many, I would say, major initiatives were on the table that could have gone either way with that, is at least a hopeful sign that we start to reinvest in our institutions, both in the House and in the Senate, and shouldn't be bashful about defending them, because for all intents and purposes, they are the things that we are a bulwark against these rapid technological changes that you were just describing.
Let me just say that those tools were designed to protect the minority from a tyranny of the majority. If those tools are abused and then become a way to impose a kind of tyranny of the minority over the majority, then you've got a political problem, a crisis. And more, I think there's a sense, because the filibuster was meant to be a rare tool.
Right.
It's become a very common tool, and as a result, there are real concerns about how it's being leveraged. I just want to say, because I'm looking at Sophia Gross, who was one of the first students in my Institute of Politics, who is now a fellow here, National Security Fellow at the McCain Institute. And when you asked me, we've had a lot of downbeat discussions here. When you ask me what gives me hope for the future, spend a few minutes with her. Spend a few minutes with these other young people who I have the privilege to work with on a regular basis. My only hope is that we can keep this thing together until they can take the wheel, because I have such faith in their ability to cope with these forces that we've been talking about. They're unintimidated by the rapid pace of change because they've grown up with it. They're brilliant and they're public spirited. And so I'm here to report that the future is bright if we can just get there.
And that's a really nice note to end on. David and Rick, Thank you very, very much.